Okay. Yeah, can we start now?
All good.
Yeah. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and good morning. I'm Adil Sultan, Acting Dean, Faculty of Aerospace Sciences and Strategic Studies at the Air University, Islamabad. On behalf of the Air University and my colleagues, I welcome you to today's webinar. I'm grateful to the panel of experts for taking time out of their very busy schedules and for agreeing to join today's conversation. I'm also grateful to all the guests who have joined or in the process of joining for their time and participation. Ladies and gentlemen, the ongoing discussions on Afghanistan in the region and elsewhere are not about military victory or defeat. This is a political transformation that started in early 1970s, eventually leading to the shift in the global balance of power. After 3 decades since the end of Cold War in 1991, the history seems to be repeating with almost same actors, but different interests and objectives. At present, Afghanistan remains in a state of fragility and uncertainty due to the sudden US troops withdrawal and also because of the governance challenges being faced by the new and less experienced Taliban regime. Reluctance by the international community to accord recognition to the new Afghan government and lack of resources are additional challenges, which if remain unaddressed on an urgent basis, could once again trigger internal strife amongst various Afghan factions, and the country could end up in a civil war with serious consequences for the region and most certainly for Pakistan. It is therefore vital that all stakeholders they work together to help bring stability to the country that has been in a state of turmoil for now over half a century. This nevertheless requires better understanding of Afghanistan and sharing of roles and responsibilities of the regional as well as extra-regional powers. The experts that we have today for today's webinar will help us to untie this knot with their rich experience and diverse perspectives. I'm sure that the students and other participants who have joined us will greatly benefit from the talk and the subsequent discussions. Before we commence today's proceedings, some housekeeping announcement, because many of our participants are students and we are very excited also because we just launched this BSIR program and most of the students, probably it's the first experience for them to have this kind of interaction with the experts. So some housekeeping. All speakers may speak for 15-20 minutes so that we have sufficient time for discussion, but this is not a fixity. You can go up and down. Those who want to ask questions, please type in the question answer window and I'll try to take as many questions as possible. The speakers will also have the option to answer the questions through Q&A window or through the chat window. Now we move to our first panel of experts, Ms. Elizabeth Threadgill. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your second name correctly, Elizabeth. Yeah.
No, you did well. It's a tough one.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. So Ms. Elizabeth,
perfect.
Director South Asia Program, recently promoted Director South Asia Program at the Stimson Center. Before joining the Stimson Center, she served as a Foreign Service Officer with the US Department of State in Islamabad and in Peshawar and in Monterrey, Mexico. She has work and educational experience in China, Taiwan, Turkey, and the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, all the interesting regions. Ms. Elizabeth holds an MPhil in Politics and International Relations from the University of Cambridge. Her dissertation analyzed political and security dynamics driving the development of governance reforms in Pakistan's western border region. She speaks Pashto, Mandarin, and Spanish. That's a great combination. So all yours, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Adil. I've really been looking forward to this. It's a pleasure to be with you today with my fellow panelists. Good to see some friends and also good to be with your students. Congratulations on the launch of this program. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And this is one of my favorite things to do. While we're stuck at home with COVID, it's a way to beam in and get to be in front of a virtual classroom, if nothing else. So really looking forward to the discussion, the conversation, learning from my fellow panelists as well. So I have been asked to take a look at what we can expect for the role of the US and other major powers in Afghanistan going forward. Other major powers was left open, so I will be focusing on Russia and China. I'm guessing China might also come into play in the regional section as well, so that might be an interesting point of comparison. Here's what I'm going to be arguing, and I should say, you know, this is my opinion. This might not even be a mainstream opinion in Washington, but I'm going to try to connect the dots as I see them. I'll go into history a little bit too, but kind of focus on the role that the U.S. and other major powers have played in Afghanistan and the region, and what I see going forward. So in terms of main themes, and I'm going to be trying to argue here today, I think there's an assumption in the region that the US and other major powers can shape events as they wish. You know, that given the influence, given the power, given the presence of US and international forces previously in Afghanistan, that was going to be conclusive or decisive. But I think both history and recent events tell us that the reality is much more complex. There's no denying that Washington, London, Moscow, and Beijing have had a dramatic impact on the region. But the outcomes of those major powers' involvement, I think, have been shaped to a great extent by local dynamics and regional interests in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and their neighbors. So what I'll try to do is, throughout this conversation, explore examples of this interplay between the local and the global interests as it's developed from colonial times to today and even going forward. Then I'll assess whether Afghanistan is among major powers. And finally, I'll wrap up by analyzing opportunities and risks that could emerge from a more competitive framework in Afghanistan. So to start, let's tackle this kind of global meets local dynamic. And I am going to take us back historically. I think too often these conversations tend to start at the Cold War, if you're going back in time. But to my mind, it's important to remember a previous major power, and that is colonial Britain, and the role that colonialism and Britain as really an unrivaled global power has played with significant influence in the region. So going back in time, the British never fully conquered Afghanistan, despite multiple attempts. In the end, had to essentially compromise that it would become a buffer zone between the British Raj and the Russian sphere of influence. And part of the way that they did that, and I think perhaps one of the original sins of how borders were demarcated in the region, is the Duran Line, which was agreed in 1893. But under the threat of an economic embargo by the British. And that has led to a great deal of tension. It's a fully internationally recognized border, but still today it is a through line of tension that I think has played an outside role and maybe an underappreciated role, even in determining the course of events and the influence of US and other major powers. To that, I would also add the approach that the British took to what was then called FATA, the Federally Administered Tribal Areas, using the Frontier Crimes Regulation as a governance code. Those choices had a very deep impact on the region. We saw the continuation after partition, and indeed it was only a couple of years ago that FATA was integrated into Pakistan proper and the FCR was abolished. But I think that approach, even though it was on the Pakistan side of the border, has had a significant impact in shaping regional dynamics and indeed the region in which major powers have operated. And then, of course, partition itself, looking at the India-Pakistan rivalry that's developed, the demands that it touched off for an independent or autonomous Pashtunistan. And so I think in all of that, while of course there was local agency, we can see the role that the British played in setting the terms in some ways of the regional rival and tensions that we see today. So moving forward in time to the Cold War, I would argue that beyond the influence of the US and now the Soviet Union, this time period, it was really local rivalries in part that determined the Cold War alignments that developed and then in turn further shaped Afghanistan and the region. So going back to the 1950s, Pakistan joined the US-led Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and then the subsequent Central Treaty Organization in the mid-1950s, ostensibly as a bulwark against communism, in part to buttress its resource-poor military against the Indian threat. So right after partition, the Pakistan military was under-resourced, and so this was seen as a means of gaining access to training, to weapon systems, through that cooperation with the US in the Cold War. In turn, this spurred Afghan fears of its neighbors' growing capacity. So as Pakistan is gaining weapons, gaining capacity, there is obviously tension between both sides that's been playing out since partition. And this in part leads Kabul to abandon its non-aligned position and to accept assistance from the Soviet Union. And that included political and alleged financial backing of Pashtun separatist groups. And so here we see, because of the tensions that were playing out bilaterally between Afghanistan and Pakistan, both sides end up on opposite ends of the spectrum in the Cold War. Going forward, of course, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the ensuing US and Saudi support for the Mujahideen proxies played an enormous role in shaping regional dynamics. But I think it's also important to remember that the Mujahideen fighters were actually, they predated the Soviet invasion and US support. This was a strategy, albeit at a much, much smaller scale, that was started after 1971 during a time of insecurity about Pakistan's territorial integrity, when the Dawood regime in Kabul was going after some of the more religiously oriented groups in Afghanistan. They sought refuge across the border in Pakistan and were given training and some equipment in an attempt to counter what was assumed to be a pro-Pashtun separatist stance in Kabul. And so those groups formed the foundation that would later become the strategy that, with US and Saudi support, by the mid-1980s was receiving upwards of $500 million a year. So obviously scales were dramatically different, but again, I see this as an example of a way that local regional rivalries have in many ways shaped the influence of outside powers. Zooming forward in time, we come to the past 20 years in Afghanistan and the role that the US, its NATO allies have played. And I would argue that what we've seen is that the US and other major powers have been unable to effectively execute both the counterterrorism and the nation building missions in Afghanistan, due in large part to local dynamics. So just looking at the balance sheet, if you will, Washington has provided, best we can assess from open source figures, nearly $145 billion in reconstruction assistance to Afghanistan over the past 20 years. That is a number that does not account for a lot of the military spending, which is more difficult to track. So I think it's safe to say that that number is far higher, but even so, it's an enormous sum. And to Pakistan, that number is approximately 34 billion in both civilian and military assistance in that same time period. And I think it's important to reflect on the way that that influx of money, just like during the Cold War, has shaped local economies and has led to a great deal of churn, we can say, on both sides in terms of the impact on the political economy in the region. Of course, the human cost of the war, it runs to best we can estimate more than 170,000 killed in Afghanistan and nearly 70,000 in Pakistan, depending on which figures you cite. So that's, I think, top of mind and what we must remember in terms of the role of major powers, but also regional dynamics. We have seen progress in issues like education, women's rights, and health, but unfortunately, they're proving fragile, as headlines coming out of Afghanistan demonstrate. And so, in sum, it appears to me that the US and its NATO partners have both been unable to defeat the Taliban or force it to break ties with terrorist groups, due in large part to um, the approach that was taken, but also to the local and regional dynamics behind those groups, right? There were longstanding ties between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, based in the end on both culture, but developed over time, and a mutual dependency. And so the expectation from Washington that the Taliban would break ties with Al Qaeda in the end, I think, has proven unrealistic. Similarly, the nation building mission, while analysts, I think, in Washington are quick to deny that that was ever a goal of our presence in Afghanistan, going back in time to the Bush administration, it was clearly an objective. And the speed with which the Afghan army collapsed, facing the Taliban offensive across the country, I think, shows the fragility of what outside powers were able to accomplish in Afghanistan, given the circumstances on the ground. So much more to unpack there, but I'm going to stop the historical section and move on to a little bit more analysis. So I think going forward, a major question to look at is whether Afghanistan is likely to be a site of cooperation or one of competition. To my mind, it's been surprising how much cooperation we have seen among the major powers in Afghanistan. There's obviously been some hedging behavior, some quiet support for the Taliban, especially by Russia. But given how intense great power competition has become, it's notable, really, that Afghanistan has not become a site of a proxy war among the major powers. And I think that speaks to the common interests in counterterrorism, in Afghanistan's stability, and in connectivity between Afghanistan and Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East. It's translated in many ways to a coordinated effort to support a political settlement through negotiations. And we've seen the US, Russia, and China all play a role in that. I think the extended Troika arrangement has proven surprisingly effective, given the context of ongoing geopolitical tensions. Unclear what happens to the extended Troika now. Russia had recently proposed potentially a new meeting of the extended Troika. I haven't seen much of a response from the other side, but that's an open question. But I think just in terms of negotiating, right? The US was actively involved in talks in Doha. Russia had the Moscow process, and China, dating back all the way to 2014, 2015, has been involved in trying to bring the sides together, including in Urumqi. So, I think it's worth taking a step back and just reflecting on how different the situation could have been if there had been a full-out proxy war waged among the major powers in Afghanistan, and the fact that that hasn't come to pass. So that brings me to the question of with the Taliban takeover now, what happens next? Do we see a risk of competition growing? I think there are some clouds on the horizon here. And in large part, it's due to a disagreement over how to best influence the Taliban and maintain security. So I see incentives for both China and Russia to break ranks with the international community and either formally or de facto recognize the Taliban in order to protect their immediate security interests. The idea that quiet deal making with the Taliban will be a better way of engaging, and might insulate them from some of the immediate impacts that we could see from a more restrictive stance, including refugee spillover, emboldenment of terror groups. China in particular being sharing a small but nonetheless a border with Afghanistan feels these effects very immediately. And I think that shapes its calculus. So from the perspective of the US and Western powers, though, so far they've been more focused on using leverage to try to secure human rights concessions, to ensure counterterrorism compliance, and are reluctant to give up that leverage in order to work with the Taliban. So again, both sides are seeking to use influence in order to shape outcomes. One just seems to be more intent on using carrots, if you will, and the other on sticks. And the challenge with that is it sets up a framework in which China and Russia provide the Taliban a lifeline and insulate it from US and Western pressure. So both of these approaches can kind of cancel each other out to a certain extent. I would also, in terms of the Taliban's perspective, because the Taliban gets a vote here, note that spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid recently said that China is our most important partner and represents a fundamental and extraordinary opportunity for us. So it seems as if that Beijing's outreach is bearing some fruit so far, but I think going forward, it's just worth watching what that means in terms of this cooperative dynamic that we've seen among the major powers. And lastly, let me just unpack briefly the opportunities and risks I see going forward. As I said, at least publicly, all sides have been proceeding cautiously. We haven't seen any formal recognition so far. We've seen relatively unified messaging on calls for an inclusive government, human rights, that sort of thing. But I think maintaining that cohesion over time is likely to become difficult. That said, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion necessarily. This is maybe a contrarian viewpoint, but I'll argue it for to play the devil's advocate here, and curious to hear your thoughts. I think there's a possibility that future tensions are overblown. And there's a lot of, particularly in Washington right now, given the US-China rivalry, I think there's some alarmist analysis that, this is China's opportunity. The US has ceded ground on the chessboard. And I think that's overblown to a certain extent. And I'd point to three things briefly. The first is the idea that China is going to really benefit from this economically, and that's going to disadvantage the US in great power competition. I think it's important to look at Chinese investment that we've seen so far in Afghanistan. My colleague at the Stimson Center, Yoon Soon, is a phenomenal expert on this question, and according to her research, Chinese investment in Afghanistan has been very limited and will likely to continue to be so in the near future. Foreign direct investment in 2021 through July was only $2.4 million. That's million with an M. And in all of 2020 was $4.4 million. Also through July, there were only $130,000 in new service contracts. And I think those numbers are pretty astounding to me. I had to read back through that passage a few times. That's not to say that we won't see an increase. China has already pledged $31 million in humanitarian support, but I think Beijing has taken a very cautious approach so far. On the security side too, there are, in my mind, again, overblown analyses saying that this is going to give Beijing, again, a piece on the chessboard, right? A place from which to anchor its operations and expand its reach into Central Asia. I think it's really unlikely that Beijing is going to get sucked into Afghanistan as a security provider in the same way that we've seen over the past 20 years. To my mind, Beijing is much more likely to try to strike quiet deals and to work in that way rather than any sort of a formal presence. And then on the human rights point, this is tough. I don't see other major powers really pushing for human rights over the long term in Afghanistan. That seems to me to be much more of a focus in the US and the West. But that said, in all likelihood, I think the US's attention will shift in the not too distant future to more of a competitive framework with China. There will still obviously be attention to it, but I think going forward, we're unlikely to see that as being a major and continuing focus down the road, particularly after a year or two. Again, many will still be focused on it, but it won't have the headlines that it has over the past month. So wrapping up, to my mind, the US should try to coordinate with China and Russia as long as possible to the extent that our interests overlap. The tough part will be sorting out exactly how that works, given the fact that China and Russia seem to be more intent on working with the Taliban, on using a carrots approach, and the US and other Western powers are more intent on using leverage to try to force their hand. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again for the opportunity and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fascinating. I'm sure there would be many questions about some of the statements that you left for the students to interpret themselves. So let's move to our second speaker, Mr. Ijaz Haider. He's the executive editor at Indus News. He was previously a Ford Scholar at the Program on Arms Control, Disarmament, and International Security at the University of Illinois. He has also been a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C., where he did work on civil-military relations in Pakistan and US-Pakistan ties. He has been news editor of the Friday Times and the foreign and op-ed editor of Daily Times. Before joining Friday Times, Ijaz Haider was assistant editor at the Lahore edition of the Frontier Post. During his career, he has reported extensively on security issues, Afghanistan, and political Islam. His weekly column for the Friday Times focuses on security, Pakistani politics, Pakistan-India relations, and political Islam. Ijaz, all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope I'm not breaking up or anything.
No, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So let me begin with the traditional way of thanking the Department of Aerospace Sciences and Strategic Studies University, as to you, Dr. Adil Sultan, for arranging this webinar and inviting me to express my views. Now, Elizabeth has already given us a broad spectrum view, including a bird's eye view of history and the issue of Duran Line, which is something of particular interest to me. And on that, I would like to say something when we get to Q&A. But for now, I'm going to confine myself to regional players and implications for Pakistan. I plan to do that from Pakistan's perspective, though we could return to the role and interest of Iran later. So let's begin by flagging the central dilemma that informs the current Pakistan policy towards the evolving situation in Afghanistan. Now, these are not the 90s. Pakistan cannot and frankly does not want to go against the regional and international consensus on what the de facto Taliban government must do in order to be engaged constructively by the world and down the road to be accepted as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And this bit is, of course, further down the road, and I'm not going to put a timeline on this, but obviously, if there is engagement and if things do not go south, then that is the logical sort of culmination of the process. On the other hand, Pakistan also fears that if constructive engagement is inordinately withheld, it could delay the socio-economic assistance Afghanistan urgently needs. That foremost would lead to the worsening of the humanitarian crisis unfolding there. And let's not kid ourselves, there is definitely a crisis, and no less than the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has spoken about it. Now, that said, Pakistan also understands and supports the push for an inclusive political and constitutional compact as the Taliban move beyond the current interim setup. This has been stated clearly by Pakistan at the highest levels of government, including most recently by Prime Minister Imran Khan in an interview to the BBC, which was aired on 21st September. If they do not, and I'm quoting from what Mr. Khan said, if they do not include all the factions, sooner or later, they'll have a civil war. That would mean an unstable, chaotic Afghanistan and an ideal place for terrorists. That is a worry, unquote. Equally, Pakistan has been pleading for patience and contextualizing the idea of inclusivity. In other words, what I'm saying is that Pakistan wants to situate it, or wants the regional players as well as the global players to situate the idea of inclusivity within the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. The world community has to give more time to the group to meet their promises and also understand that the movement has to grapple with debates and viewpoints within. And that necessarily creates tension between the context and the acontextual external pressure. Or should I say, largely acontextual external pressure, because as Elizabeth said, the approach of the Russian Federation and China is fairly different in certain ways, from that of the US and its Western allies, although there is a consensus as far as terrorist threats and other such transnational terrorist threats are concerned. Now, situated within this is also the problem of sequencing. Elizabeth has actually touched upon this, but the United States and its allies want the Taliban to immediately follow the West's political and rights blueprint for Afghanistan before the Taliban government is accepted and the aid resumed. Now, Pakistan, while stressing the importance of an inclusive political compact and the rights of women and minorities, has been pleading for delinking immediate international assistance from other issues to avert the humanitarian crisis and its attendant consequences. Now, clearly, anyone who's observing the situation or is not taking a snapshot view of current Pakistan policy, but can figure out the long trajectory of it, would see that it makes eminent sense from Pakistan's perspective, as also the regional perspective in many ways. Pakistan wants the best equilibrium under the circumstances. I stress that because the circumstances, the current situation, the context, all of this is very important. And that essentially means to get the Taliban to move in the right direction while preventing humanitarian assistance and development aid from being hostage to other issues of concern. And when I say this, by no means am I trying to reduce the importance of those concerns. They're important. The idea, the thrust of my argument in terms of my own understanding of Pakistan's policy essentially is that there are the immediate requirements that need to be fulfilled, and there are the medium to long-term concerns that need to come further down the road. So this is a situation where I would say, quoting from Voltaire, that the best is very likely the enemy good. And this is a point which needs to be understood. Pakistan has also been consistent in arguing that a humanitarian crisis or an economic meltdown, frankly, there's already an economic meltdown, can lead to refugee outflow, which would have negative consequences for Pakistan and other states bordering Afghanistan. Now, such a situation, far from incentivizing the Taliban to follow international norms, could lead to their isolation and allow the hardline elements to get an upper hand. That would inevitably shrink the space for the moderate elements within the group, as also external actors to influence the movement's behavior. We have seen Pakistan's high momentum regional and international diplomacy, and it has to be seen in view of the challenges and threats posed by an unstable Afghanistan. It must deal with, and when I say it, I'm talking about Pakistan, must deal with and try to influence the behavior of the Taliban, but at the same time, and that's the difficult part of it. Well, actually, both parts are difficult. It has their own interests and want outcomes that serve those interests. So at this point, let me just go through the, it's just a very sketchy view of how the states bordering Afghanistan are looking at the problem. And so it's their view, not Pakistan's. For Tajikistan, an inclusive political setup has been a point of agitation with respect to representation of all ethnic groups, especially Tajiks. I cannot overemphasize this because there are multiple statements which are on the record and can be actually picked up from the website of the Tajik Ministry of Foreign Affairs, especially Tajiks. And Sirojuddin Moureddin, who's the foreign minister of Tajikistan, actually made a statement saying that they make up 46% of the population of Afghanistan, which demographic percentage is clearly erroneous, but it gives one an idea about the Shamil's concern for Tajiks. Both Moureddin and Tajikistan President Emomali Rahmon have also been pressing the point about Panjshir, with Rahmon calling for speedy elimination of the conflict and tensions in the Panjshir province by declaring a ceasefire and opening roads for providing humanitarian assistance to the population of the region. And this, he said, recently. Iran took the same position during the Taliban offensive in Panjshir. In fact, its foreign minister, Hussein Amir Abdullahian, as also its official spokesperson, Saeed Khatibzadeh, spoke of foreign intervention, a misplaced reference to the propaganda that Pakistani military was supporting the Taliban in their offensive. Fortunately, Iran has since walked back on those statements, but its interests there are permanent. It has influence among the Hazara, the Tajiks, and Fasivan. And just like in the Middle East, Tehran wants to expand its footprint in Afghanistan. It helped the Taliban tactically. Elizabeth, I think, mentioned that, but it seeks to reap a strategic benefit out of that. And as I said, during Q&A, it would be interesting to sort of go deeper into Iranian interests and Iranian approaches in Afghanistan, and by extension, the region itself. Now, Uzbekistan is the natural fallback state for Uzbeks in Afghanistan. This is what I call the tyranny of geography. But while Uzbekistan desires Uzbek representation in a political setup in Afghanistan, it has refrained from making statements that implicate Pakistan in terms of any role with reference to the Taliban or any interference. And on 16 September, there was a meeting between Prime Minister Khan and President Shavkat Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan. The Uzbekistan Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that the two leaders discussed the situation in the region in the context of the current situation in Afghanistan. An agreement was reached to continue close cooperation on the issues of ensuring regional security. President Mirziyoyev, in his recent speech at the UNGA, also said that during these challenging times, it is impossible to isolate Afghanistan and leave it within the range of its problems. Now, this position, as you can see, is clearly in line with Pakistan's. There is another interesting neighbor, and that is Turkmenistan. And Turkmenistan has had long-term interests with Afghanistan involving energy and infrastructure projects. And by all indications, it has accepted the ground reality in Afghanistan, not post fall of Kabul, but before that. And so even before the fall of the Ashraf Ghani government, Turkmen diplomats were in contact with Taliban reps. And the Turkmen foreign minister, Rashid Meredov, indicated that Turkmenistan has spent about $1.25 billion on projects integrating Turkmenistan with Afghanistan. And on 18th August, the country's foreign ministry stated that it was in regular communication with the Taliban authorities. Interestingly, the level of panic in Ashgabat is very low, going by the statements, compared to other states bordering Afghanistan. China, again, one can, go for a deeper dive into that. And I think Elizabeth made some very interesting points with reference to China. But it has consistently stated, and what I'm going to say is basically corroborates what Elizabeth was saying. It is closely monitoring the situation in Afghanistan. And it has also talked about a constructive role for the United Nations. And it has urged all internal political actors in Afghanistan to find a peaceful settlement. But it has also repeatedly made clear that it does not interfere or want to interfere in Afghanistan's internal affairs. As a matter of fact, just a segue, because Elizabeth also talked about Chinese investment, I will quote from an op-ed that Ajmal Ahmadi wrote. This is about, I think, a month and a half ago for Financial Times. And he was talking about where the money will come from for Afghanistan. And he said that, the assertion that China, Russia, or even Pakistan, and I'm quoting from what he wrote in that op-ed, or even Pakistan will invest large sums in Afghanistan is not realistic. In 2019, as Afghanistan's Minister of Commerce, I attended the second Belt and Road Initiative conference in Beijing. However much we tried, Afghanistan was never part of the BRI, and I would not expect it to be a part of the initiative in the near future. Now, I'm not saying that his prediction is going to come true. Of course, the situation evolves, but he's making an interesting and important point there. However, there is also the Troika, which is Pakistan, China, and Russia, and they are closely cooperating on Afghanistan. The recent visit of the special representatives of the three countries to Afghanistan was reflective of that cooperation and a considered policy to reach out to the Taliban and stay engaged. A Russian foreign ministry statement said that an agreement was reached to maintain constructive contacts in the interest of Afghanistan's peace and prosperity and regional stability and development. And the statement also added that the Taliban have also stressed their special focus on improving relations with Russia, China, and Pakistan. And yes, as I was noting what Elizabeth was saying, Zabiullah Mujahid's statement, and not to forget Mullah Baradur's meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi in Tianjin, and as I wrote at that time, that if anyone thinks that meeting happened just like that, and there was no Pakistani role in getting that meeting to happen, then they should go and read Mills and Boons. Now, Qatar, which is not a state that is contiguous, but is a state that has played a very significant role and a major role in advancing a settlement in Afghanistan. And it's interesting that at the ongoing 76th session of the UNGA, Qatar's Amir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, stressed continuing engagement with the Taliban, noting that a boycott would only lead to polarization, while dialogue could bring in positive results. So these are the various, as I said, I'm just giving a sort of sketchy overview of what the regional countries are saying and where they stand with reference to Afghanistan. But I would be remiss if I don't say a word about rights, especially rights of women, because this is one of those issues which is, as far as the United States and its Western allies are concerned, it's a very important issue. So my view is that in an ideal world, women in Afghanistan should have all the rights we associate with modern sensibility. But while it is important to continue to push the envelope, and I'm all for it, policymaker has to opt for the doable within a context rather than pushing for the desirable and ending up with nothing. So I was actually having a conversation with a couple of people, and I said, okay, look at it like this. Is it more important to speak about the dress code, for instance, just an example, or pushing the Taliban to accept that women must be educated and be part of the workforce? So for me, as also I think from what I can gather for the Pakistani policymakers, the latter is more important, given the fact that you are dealing with the situation on the ground. But that does not mean that you do not establish a baseline. So it's important for the policymaker to contextualize the situation and accept a compromise, but they cannot give in on the absolute baseline. And so the baseline defense is important because any further progress has to depend on an acceptance by all sides of what that line is. The right to education and the right to work, including, the women entrepreneurs. That's the kind of baseline that, one has to push for and the Taliban have to accept. A couple of words about inclusiveness before I wrap up. To me, you have to see it in terms of power sharing with other ethnic groups, but that does not necessarily mean that you bring back those discredited former warlords like Dostum, like Ata Noor, various others, including the on-the-run former first vice president of Afghanistan, Mr. Amrullah Saleh, who is now in Tajikistan. That's not something that Taliban are going to accept. Now, their inclusion of Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazara into that seems to be an attempt to try and sort of address that issue. Secondly, a compact that includes rural Afghanistan into any gains and subsumes local economies into the national chain. I think this is where the Soviet Union, for all its attempted reforms, as well as the United States, failed. The focus mostly was on the urban areas, and rural Afghanistan was a place like, Helmand is a great example of that. That was to be bombed, and that was where the counterterrorism operations were to be conducted. And thirdly, I consider inclusiveness as taking into account the social and cultural aspects of Afghan society. And I use the plural, in a considered way, because there is no one Afghan society. It's a mix of multiple cultures and socioeconomic ideas. So from a political and security perspective, I think that is where the cooperation instead of competition would likely happen. There are two primary concerns. One is that Afghan soil should not harbor transnational terrorist groups, and I think that is as much a concern of the United States as it is of China, the Russian Federation, the regional states, and certainly Pakistan. And secondly, that Afghanistan should have a viable economy and political stability to prevent refugee outflow. And I think essentially these are the 2 points on which one can have intra-regional consensus and cooperation also, and cooperation with extra-regional globals also. So I'm going to stop there, and we can take up some of those issues that I haven't either touched upon or which need further elaboration, as I said, with reference to Iran's role. Could take that up later. Thank you.
You're on mute. Dr. Adil, we can't hear you. You're on mute, I think.
Oh, yeah. So my apologies. Yeah. So
We're still grappling with these technologies despite year and a half of COVID isolation.
absolutely, and I think it will continue. Yeah. So Ms. Hamna Khan is the third speaker. She's director of the Center for Afghanistan, Middle East, and Africa at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Before her current appointment, she was a senior research fellow focusing on Afghanistan and FATA. Over a 14-year period, she has published extensively on the subject and presented her research at the national and international fora. A recipient of FCO's Chevening Scholarship from 2009 to 2010, she did her master's degree in democracy, politics, and governance from Royal Holloway University of London. She's a graduate of Quaid-e-Azam University and is now pursuing a doctoral degree from the same university. Ms. Amna Khan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adil, for giving me the opportunity for a topic I think every capital is grappling with. Now, we're all aware, the situation in Afghanistan has certainly taken a drastic turn, not only with the Taliban takeover of the country, but also the rather irresponsible, if I may say, exit of US forces from Afghanistan. Now, since the Taliban takeover, we have seen that with the exception of terrorist attacks by the ISKP and resistance in the Panjshir, which appears to have mellowed down, I think the transition process has been relatively smooth as the group has faced little or no resistance. Now, so far, we have seen the Taliban presenting a rather non-offensive, vision of themselves and a rather relatively moderate face compared to the past, where they have allowed the reopening of schools and the return of women to work in limited areas. But it has happened, even if it is limited. Now, while the group had time and again assured that it would work towards the formation of an inclusive setup, and in fact, we saw the group engaging with major Afghan political stakeholders, unfortunately, this has not been the case, with the exception of a few non-Pashtuns and of course, the absence of women. The government, unfortunately, is anything but representative. And I think this is a cause that is not really helping the group. However, now that the group is in power, I think the real test for the Taliban has only just begun. The test is not, in fact, the capture of power, but it is more, I think, about legitimacy, recognition, acceptance, and of course, the performance of the group. Now, although the present Taliban dispensation does appear to be, focused on, politically savvy overtures and an attempt for trust building in the region as well as beyond, it does remain to be seen how the group will fare their dealings, within Afghanistan as well as the global community. Now, the challenges for the Taliban government are enormous. And their ability to deal with them will, of course, determine their future legitimacy and, of course, the authority the group will have, if at all. Now, while the group has said that the newly announced setup is an interim one and that the complete cabinet is yet to be announced, this does give us some hope, an indication that there is room for expansion and hopefully a future political government that will be more representative. And I think it is important in this regard for the group to realize that if they do not honor their pledges of reform, they will lose the support and the recognition the group so badly needs, not only from the international community, but I think more so from regional countries to legitimize their rule. Because I think the group is aware that if they're going to get support in any form, it's going to be more from the immediate neighbors in the beginning, and then it's going to be dependent on the international community. So I think this is a historic opportunity for the group to present itself as a credible player that is truly dedicated to the future of Afghanistan. And this is something that the group seems to claim time and again. So for the time being, I think recognition of the group may not depend so much so on the inclusion of other political factors, but whether the Taliban can deliver on their promises of reform. Now, even within the confines of this Taliban-dominated setup, as I said, a lot will depend on how the country runs in terms of governance, foreign relations, counterterrorism assurances, which I think are at the top of the list, and also what is going to happen to former Afghan institutions. Rather, I shouldn't say former because they still do exist, such as the police, the army, and of course, a very important issue that is keeping people awake in the international community, and that is the rights of women, and of course generally human rights. Now that the Taliban have been given a chance, I think it is imperative that they deliver, particularly on ensuring that Afghanistan does not become a safe haven for transnational terrorist groups. And I think it is important to highlight here that these counterterrorism assurances should not just be limited to, say, the Americans or the international community, but I think regional countries as well. It is imperative that the Taliban deliver on this front. Now, a lot is being said about regional ownership and responsibility. Now, certainly, I think, bewildered by instability in Afghanistan, I do feel that regional countries have come to the forefront to play a more prominent role in Afghanistan. And I think we've seen this. Pakistan always done that. We've seen that with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Iranians, and of course the Central Asians. And I think there is, how should I term it, a strange strategic coincidence, if I may, where regional countries have come to the realization that they can no longer, sit on the sidelines. And therefore, I think, they feel that it is time for them to take ownership and not depend on the international community to always bail them out. So despite their previous differences and divergences, it appears that Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, I keep on referring to immediate because I think that's an important distinction that needs to be made. That is Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, and of course the Central Asians. They appear to be on the same page where they have a common regional vision for the future of Afghanistan. And I think for the time being, it entails, of course, regional ownership, as I just spoke about, an inclusive political setup, as well as curbing transnational terrorist groups, as well as, the illegal movement of arms and drugs. So while there certainly is regional consensus, I think the important question here is whether the region is willing to step in, and more so, which country is willing to play the role of that regional credible interlocutor. Now, I personally feel that there is certainly an appetite within the region to play a bigger role. And I think in this regard, while maybe the international community may be not so comfortable with this particular player, but I think China may be better placed to head this role, because unlike other regional countries or neighbors of Afghanistan, it does not have historical baggage. Moreover, it does enjoy a pretty good relationship, not only with the Taliban, but other political factions in Afghanistan as well. And I think this is something that Elizabeth alluded to, where the Taliban have been giving statements that show that China is that one country that could probably play this role. Now, while regional countries can explore the possibility, I think, of establishing a regional framework, a monitoring mechanism that at least can try to convince the Taliban to deliver on its pledges of reform and other promises, primarily counterterrorism, I think the immediate focus should be on the formation of a regional assistance mechanism that can focus on supporting the immediate requirements of the Afghan economy, which you all know is in shambles. Now, this, of course, can be expanded, into other regional, mechanisms that can expand to other areas. But for the time being, I think it is important that focuses on a regional assistance mechanism. And again, while there certainly can be collective pressure from the region, or for that matter, even the possibility of a regional monitoring mechanism that can make the Taliban deliver, the onus at the end of the day is on the Taliban. They will have to deliver. I think in this regard, the Taliban are conscious of the fact that it is the immediate neighborhood that they will have to depend on more so as compared to the international community. And therefore, again, I think this has been repeated several times, it is imperative that the Taliban ensure that they will not entertain any terrorist group, whether it's the TTP, it's the IMU, the ETIM, whatever you name it. This is imperative. Moreover, I think while the topic that was given to me was regional economic connectivity, and this certainly can take place, I think for now, the immediate focus is on, providing assistance to this new political dispensation, which badly needs engagement, if not recognition. This is important. Engagement does not mean recognizing the group. Moreover, I think it's important to also focus on the US's role. Now, look, the US has a responsibility to fulfill. Let us not forget, Washington did legitimize the group by signing the Doha Agreement in the absence of Kabul, and more so when Washington began to execute the agreement without getting anything substantial in return from the Taliban. Remember, the Taliban didn't really push, when it came to a ceasefire or say intra-Afghan talks, although I have to say President Ghani was equally responsible. If anything, the Taliban did deliver on not attacking American forces. And hence you did see positive statements coming out of the previous political dispensation where they said that the Taliban was the more responsible stakeholder. Now, I have to say here that when President Biden came into power, there was this constant narrative of a review of the process, and I don't think anybody anticipated such, I have to say, an irresponsible withdrawal. So therefore, I think Washington has a responsibility and a major role to play, and that is by ensuring that the Taliban, of course, deliver, and at the same time, not isolating the group, but engaging with the group by providing much needed aid and assistance for the people of Afghanistan. And I think this is a distinction that needs to be made. Even if you, sanction the group or you disengage with them, at the end of the day, it's the common Afghan that is going to suffer. And therefore, one hopes that those mistakes will not be, repeated. I get this notion time and again that Afghanistan is being viewed as a regional issue or a regional responsibility. But let us not forget, Afghanistan has always had the ingredients of a global issue. Therefore, again, it is imperative that the international community, along with regional countries, continue to remain engaged with Afghanistan. Disengagement, again, will only lead to isolation. And again, as I just said, one cannot, see mistakes of the past repeated. At least one hopes that will not happen. Now, in the end, I will say that Afghanistan must be viewed as a collective and a shared responsibility. Shifting the blame is counterproductive, and particularly when it comes to the Pakistan-US relationship, I think the Americans need to engage with Pakistan of shifting the onus. And lastly, while it is a shared responsibility, one also hopes that better sense will prevail amongst the Taliban, where hopefully the group will focus on a political setup that is inclusive, that is responsible, that is accountable, and lastly, one that can serve the Afghan people. So I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being precise. Now we have plenty of time for question and answer also. Yeah. Thank you. Great. I have several points from the presentations made by the experts. I think these were fascinating presentations, but I'll give first the opportunity to the guests who very patiently listen to all these presentations. So I'll take first two questions. First is about Ijaz that refer to Iranian interests. So this is the question by Aisha Rubab. So Ijaz, you can take that. And the another question is about, this is by somebody who doesn't want his or her name to be displayed. So it's an anonymous attendee. Why couldn't the Afghan forces better resist the Taliban despite all the US training and assistance? Maybe Elizabeth, you can take this, and we can, after these two questions, then we'll go for the second round. Yeah, Ijaz, go ahead, please.
Okay, there are three basic reasons for the Iranian strategy of supporting the Taliban tactically, but at the same time, there's a long history of enmity between the Taliban and Iran. There was the incident in Mazar-e-Sharif when the Taliban, this was back in the 90s, I'm talking about 97, they killed 9 Iranian diplomats, and later, of course, and Iran actually arrayed lots of forces along the Iran-Afghanistan border. And you might also recall that during the Bonn process, Iran was very active And Jawad Zarif, former foreign minister, was one of those people, one of those Iranian diplomats who was very active there. But gradually, the Iranian interests began to sort of diverge from those of the US and United States allies' interests. And then they started supporting the Taliban tactically. The three reasons. One is that Iran wants to secure its borders against hostile actors, refugees, trafficking. It also wants to have its own influence and, by extension, prevent the influence of other governments into Afghanistan. Then they also want to secure the interests of the Hazara, the Persian-speaking Tajiks, and also Farsi ones. And the issue of water is also very important for Iran. You might recall that in the past few months, the situation of water in Iran has been terrible. Lakes have been drying up, and the Iranians need lots of water from the Helmand River basin. And so these are some of those issues which force the Iranians to adopt strategies that are a mix of cooperation and but also a degree of cautious wariness with reference to Afghanistan. Now, I might also add that the current commander of the IRGC Quds Force, Ismail Qani, who's the successor to slain Major General Soleimani, is essentially an Afghanistan hand. He has been dealing with Afghanistan for a very long time, and his presence in the position where he is obviously is likely to determine to a large extent how Iran proceeds through this. I also said in my opening that when the Panjshir offensive began, the statements from the Iranians were rather, although they didn't name Pakistan directly, but it was quite clear that they were implicating Pakistan. On a personal note, the day this happened, I was doing my program on Indus News, and I had an Iranian expert on my program. So before starting the program off camera, as we were exchanging pleasantries, he asked me, he said, there are reports of Pakistani drones and helicopter gunships in Panjshir. And what do you want to say about that? And I was for a moment taken aback because he is one of those, rather, in terms of his presence on Al Jazeera and elsewhere. So I was somewhat taken aback, and I said, this is sheer bunkum. Where are you getting this from? And then I actually, bilaterally sent him, sort of reports about how the Indian media and certain other media outlets were faking these news and what the facts on the ground were. But, and as I said in my statement, that the Iranians have since walked back those statements. But Iran is essentially, it considers itself a civilizational power. It considers that it needs to have influence in the region. It has adopted those strategies in the greater Middle East, and Afghanistan is no different. Pakistan and Iran have had differences during the late 80s and 90s on how to deal with Afghanistan, and I don't think that the idea of how to influence the country is going to go away. One can hope that, given the situation, that there will be more cooperation than any competition. But I think one has to, in terms of understanding the Iranian approach, one has to understand that Iran is basically a state that wants to project power. And we don't have time to go into how they've done this in the greater Middle East, how they have run proxies over wide geographies and among groups of different persuasions. It's a very interesting study. But I can send some stuff to your dean, which he can distribute among the students in order for you to get a better perspective on how Iran approaches these issues.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, would you mind answering the other question? But you can also add somebody, Myra asked also a question about what would be the future of Afghan military in the same context. So if you can answer both the questions, these are related to Afghan army.
Yeah, great questions. I think, admittedly, I think it's important to caveat a lot of this analysis that this is the first draft of history in many ways. And these are questions that scholars and analysts, including many of you, I'm sure, will be working on thinking through over the years to come. But my best guess at this point points to a few factors. And I would actually argue, using a political science term, that what we saw play out with the Afghan army was overdetermined in many ways, that there were more than one reason why we should have expected this to happen. We didn't, and that's important to point out, right? I think it was really, really telling that this happened so quickly and seems to have been such a surprise, even beyond the worst case scenarios that were gamed out. So it's really striking that there were some 1,400 Americans still present in Kabul at the embassy that put us in this position of having to run evacuations from Kabul in a way that I think the administration, it's safe to say, would not have chosen. But in terms of the question itself, I really see this as a political victory rather than a military one across the country. And that's not at a high level, it's at a local level. And I would say it in some ways mirrored the sweep that the US was able to make against Taliban positions in 2001. There was a sense that at the ground level, local commanders and fighters had a sense of which way the wind was blowing. And with the US headed for the exits, there was not confidence in the ability of the Afghan military or the Afghan government to withstand a Taliban offensive. That was compounded by issues that we've all heard a great deal about recently. So corruption within the Afghan military, the issue of ghost soldiers, certainly. So President Biden and others in the administration continue to cite this figure of 300,000 troops. It is very difficult to get an accurate assessment, but I saw the New York Times had reported one unnamed US official estimated that the real figure was maybe 1/6 of that in terms of active Afghan forces who are available for combat. Obviously, have no means of verifying that, but when you look at that number combined with the estimates of Taliban fighters, some 70 to 80,000, again, depending on which numbers you believe, it becomes a much more even fight numerically than it would seem based on the 300,000 number. But again, it didn't get to that point because of these quiet negotiations that seem to have been going on for quite some time. Also on the corruption front, just in terms of mismanagement, these were fighters spread across the country who hadn't been paid for months in some cases, who didn't have access to food rations. And so when you think about morale, you think about what they are fighting for, it leaves an open question. If you were to put yourself in that context. Likewise, challenges with military leadership. We saw a decision back in June for the replacement of the defense minister, the army chief, just as all of this was playing out. And I think that speaks to the challenges that played out down the ranks. Likewise, there was a delay in consolidating positions of the Afghan army from checkpoints that had been spread out across the country. So this was a long-standing issue, but it seems as if kind of the desire to project power and show the writ of the state, the presence of the state in rural areas through these checkposts, had traded against the ability of the Afghan army to actually protect strategic interests. So ultimately, a decision was made to consolidate positions to strategic locations, to cities, but that seems to have been too little too late. And then on the US side, I think it's important to acknowledge that we tried to build a military in our own image, in a way that was not appropriate for the ground context in Afghanistan, in terms of what was required, in terms of the human capacity, in terms of the logistics, in terms of just kind of what would make for a sustainable force. And there were a lot of missteps along the way in terms of, not about anything but the best of intentions to provide advanced equipment, to provide the kind of training that had served the US well. But it led to, in this context, an over-reliance on special forces troops that soon became exhausted, kind of parachuting from one place to another. There was an over-reliance on contractors, particularly for air support. And so in the context of withdrawal, when those contractors were removed, Afghan army forces found themselves without the air force, the air support that they had come to rely on in the way that the US had trained them to fight. And I think that is, again, coming back to this idea of the collapse being over-determined. Even if there had been a more effective military, I think it's still an open question, the extent to which it would have kept up the fight in light of the impending US withdrawal. But particularly given the structural issues that have been baked in from both the US and the Afghan sides, I think it is not surprising in hindsight that we wound up here, but was certainly surprising, and just was not an option on the table that I heard, at least in Washington, that this would happen so quickly. So, the following question was the future of the Afghan army, which is an excellent question and one that has not gotten a whole lot of attention that I've heard of. So looking forward, there is a whole extensive literature on DDR, on security sector reform, on what happens after a situation like this, when you have a transfer of power after a civil war. How do you consolidate security forces? Let's see, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if I've seen any statements from the Taliban along these lines. I don't think I have, but other panelists feel free to jump in if this is something you're tracking more closely. But I think one of the lessons learned from Washington's standpoint that would be top of mind, just in kind of thinking about how to approach this, is the mistake that was made in Iraq with the de-Baathification order. The idea that we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, we need to disband the Iraqi army. And what happens when you do that is you have some hundreds of thousands of trained, now jobless men with weapons who did not appreciate being thrown out. And so, if I were giving advice to the Taliban, it would certainly be to look for ways of incorporating the Afghan security forces into a future force structure. That will be a challenge to do, but it's something that I think going forward will help to do a couple of things. It will ideally avoid those mistakes that we saw in Iraq, where you do have these disaffected fighters who are out of a job. Of course, it carries with it the challenge of actually paying and employing them, which is particularly resonant given the economic challenges that we heard from our fellow panelists. But also when you think about inclusivity, when you think about the ethnic relations that are represented within the Afghan army, it's not a perfect mirror of Afghanistan, but it's more representative than the Taliban government that we've seen so far. And so to the extent that the Taliban is able to effectively incorporate former Afghan army fighters into some sort of future dispensation. I think it would be a positive step. It will just be a difficult one.
Just to add to what Elizabeth was saying, one, I completely agree with all the points that Elizabeth has made with reference to why the NDSF folded before the Taliban. And it was never a direct contest of arms, frankly, and so it was a political thing. We've analyzed this, and so even if the ANDSF had fought better in certain places, the outcome would still have been the same. But I want to make one point, that there were a number of military officers and observers who had been saying and who had identified all these factors with reference to the induction, recruitment, training of the ANDSF. So it should not have come as a surprise to anyone, but there was a lot of dissembling going on right to the top of the chain and back. So all of this was swept under the carpet. As a matter of fact, I keep telling people, forget about everyone else. Just look at the one oversight agency of the US government, SIGAR, and just read their reports, and you would see, and you would wonder how in Darwin's name could the US government not figure out what it was doing wrong. So you don't have to go to anywhere else. You just go to a US government oversight agency. About the Taliban pulling in the former ANDSF fighters, I don't have the reference right now, but there has been at least one statement in which they have said that they will, fighters who are prepared, those former Afghan soldiers who are prepared to be part of the new military dispensation. The policemen in some of the urban centers have already been called back and they're performing their duties. So I think the Taliban are not going to just let them, fall by the side. I think they will, rope them in. And as a matter of fact, it'll be a good mix of the Taliban could learn certain things from these former soldiers, which they have learned, in terms of their training from the US and the former SAS, the British military and the rest of it. And they can actually learn something from the way the Taliban fight. And that could be a pretty good mix.
Thank you. I'll once again request the participants, please type your question in the Q&A window, because if you're raising hand, you are putting your question in the chat box also, and the Q&A, it becomes difficult for me to manage all these things. So please put it in Q&A window so that you can be given due priority. But before I move to the participants' question, I would like to invite my co-host. She was there, she's my colleague at the department. She was also supposed to take over in case there is some connection breakdown from my side. So that's why she's there. Ms. Aida Azam, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
All right. I just quickly first also like to thank the panelists for joining us. Thank you for giving us so generously of your time and your views, and particularly to our students who were very interested in this event to begin with. My question is for all three, and it's very brief. So we've heard a lot about what regional countries and extra-regional countries expect from the new Afghan government, from the new Taliban government, and what kind of role they would like it to play moving forward. But if we could just sort of defocus on that and think specifically about the Afghan government, the current Afghan government, what kind of role perception do you feel they have for themselves within this region? As in what kind of role, what kind of image perception do they have for themselves moving forward? And to what extent does the Taliban government's view on this, to what extent would that align with the views of Afghan civil society, which is fairly polarized on this? You have equal measure of support and you have equal measure of those who are anti the government, current government. So if you could just sort of give your views on that, please.
Yeah, great. So I'll just lump another question asked by Faraz. That is also about regional countries. Why shouldn't regional countries, their say should be more than the international players? Because he says if there are international players, the major powers and the regional powers, it is going to complicate the issue. So the priority should be given to regional countries. Maybe you can lump this question with this. And I think we can take this and then move to second, third round. Go ahead, please. Anybody can start. Amna, if you want to take
I
lead.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Amna, are you still there? Maybe she has some connection problem. Meanwhile, Elizabeth or Ijaz, any of you, anybody can take lead.
Okay. Okay. Very quickly, I think there is definitely polarization within the Afghan society. There's the the urban population, the rural population. Anand Gopal, who's a fabulous investigative reporter, recently wrote a piece for the New Yorker. As a matter of fact, and not just that piece, his 2014, I think 2014 book is also one of the probably the best works on Afghanistan. So there's definitely a problem there. Lots of these Taliban fighters are rural, based fighters. Over the last 20 years, whatever else one might say about unfortunately, that could not spread out into the rural areas, but certainly in the urban centers. Not so much Jalalabad, for instance, or Kandahar, but Mazar, Kabul, and Herat. They certainly benefited. The women benefited. The youth benefited from that. This is a digital generation. They want their rights and the rest of it. And I think this is something the Taliban will have to understand. However, as I noted earlier, also, you have to understand the context and what is it that you prefer. Because if we bring the entire sort of the idea of the modern sensibility in terms of how women must be treated, that's something that's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, I would say that did not happen even when the United States was there. I mean, we had the horrific incident of a woman getting burned, being burnt in Kabul by a mob, and so on. So we have to contextualize this. And as far as the regional countries are concerned, that other question, the regional countries have the major responsibility. But in terms of developmental aid and the rest of it, as I have also quoted from Ajmal Amdi's op-ed in FT, the United States and some of its allies will have to take the lead. I mean, this is something not just in terms of the responsibility that the US owes to Afghanistan, but also in terms of the capacity. I mean, no other state, including China, has that kind of capacity in terms of putting together a number of countries and providing that aid. But then again, it's the issue of sequence. And so what comes first? Will the Taliban have to say, we're going to do X, Y, Z, because that's what you say we should do? And then the US says, okay, now we can begin to engage you, or it has to be the other way around. So it's an issue of sequencing, but certainly the broader idea of how to get Afghanistan back on the rails is something that the US will, and also because, and I think this is again something that no one really talks about. One of the major failures of the US-led coalition over the last 20 years was the fact that it never could get Afghanistan to develop its own revenue base. Monies were coming in. The elites that were there, that were representing the government, had developed this rentier mindset, and a lot of this money was being siphoned off. How and why do you think that some of these Afghans have the most expensive real estate in Dubai and elsewhere. I mean, where did that money come from? So you know, that was a major failure, that there was never any pressure. Even when the Americans knew what was happening, they were looking the other way for other reasons. So now, after the initial aid, after putting the economy on some kind of stable sort of, you know, this thing, effort needs to be made for Afghanistan to develop its own ability to generate revenue, because obviously no external power or powers can keep funding and keep giving budgetary support to the Afghan government, any Afghan government. And I'm assuming theoretically, technically, that, you know, this happens with the Taliban also. No one can do this ad infinitum.
I can jump in next, just briefly here. So in terms of maybe the other half of Aya's question in terms of how the Taliban view themselves in the region, you know, I think it's important to come back to just the immediacy of the domestic situation in Afghanistan. The Taliban have so much on their plate right now in terms of trying to take over, in terms of managing the humanitarian situation, trying to come to terms with the economy. You know, I point to an op-ed that Khurram Hussain had written a few weeks back that was just making the point of how different Afghanistan today is than it was 20 years ago, and the governance challenges that represents for the Taliban. You know, there's been a lot of talk about Taliban 2.0. Is this Taliban different than the previous one? Well, the context in which they're operating is miles different as a result of the influence of the US and other major powers in large part, though not exclusively. And so I think I haven't seen a great deal of thought at this point or action really in terms of the Taliban's foreign policy, but I think there are a couple things we can point to. So in general, I would say that their aims would be to diversify their contacts around the region. So to reach out to many of the powers that Ijaz was speaking about. They want to increase their leverage, increase their options. They want to ensure that they are on, you know, if not being recognized, at least in communication with countries around the region. And I would say that includes India too, notably, right? Like we saw the first meeting between, or at least publicly acknowledged meeting between the Indian ambassador in Qatar and Staniksai in recent weeks. And so that's something to watch going forward too. That to me is a signal that mirrors in some ways a tendency, albeit a nascent tendency for the Taliban to strike their own path in foreign policy. So I direct your attention back to August 5th, 2019, with the revocation of the special status of Indian administered Kashmir. And at that time, there was a statement that the Taliban put out basically saying, leave us out of this. That we do not interfere in bilateral issues. And I think that's really telling, just in terms of, at least at that time, how they see themselves. Again, it's early days. We don't know how this is going to develop, but it's a question that I'm going to be watching going forward. In terms of this question over priority to regional countries, you know, I think it comes back to what Ijaz was saying. And to go back to my presentation, it really emphasizes the importance of a unified approach, because I think capacity is a real question here. I will say there is a tendency to say, you know, the US must ensure X, Y, and Z. The US must hold the Taliban accountable. The US hasn't been able to do that for the past 20 years with over 100,000 troops on the ground at times. And so in this current context, when we don't have a military presence in Afghanistan, let alone a diplomatic presence, right? It's not just the military that's gone. That becomes much more difficult to do. And it's not impossible, certainly, but I think it speaks to the need for cooperation and coordination between the US, between regional powers, because it really is the unified approach that is going to be most effective in trying to hold the Taliban accountable. But I would just caution against seeing influence within the US or seeing the lack of effective US pressure as the lack of trying. This is just a difficult situation and speaks to the role that the regional countries will need to play in order to try to affect the change that I think we're all pushing.
Yeah, Amna, we were waiting
Yeah,
for you
I'm
to come
back.
back. Yeah.
Sorry,
Good.
apologies. I have issues with my internet. Certainly, I think the Taliban are going to focus more on a regional approach. And I think if we go back before the Taliban took over, they went on a so-called regional tour, where I think they were trying to pacify regional countries before, when they took over key border points, that business would resume as usual. And we did see that happening on, the major key border points that they took over. And I think this was an attempt by the group to pacify regional countries, that once we do take over, we will try to, address concerns, of regional countries. And I think this primarily revolves around, again, counterterrorism assurances. This is a major issue, I think, for regional countries. To be very honest with you, I think even the international community might overlook questions of human rights to a certain extent, as long as, the Taliban can deliver on making Afghanistan safe, in the sense that it will not pose a serious terrorist threat to any regional or international community member, number one. Number two, I think engagement is going to be by the Taliban directly with regional countries, and I think probably they're going to work through Qatar to deal with the international community. And I think maybe international stakeholders would be more comfortable dealing, with the Taliban through Qatar. This is something that I think we're going to see more of. Besides that, I think it's important to realize that, the Taliban, have inherited a lot. They've inherited weak and divided institutions. And I think it's unfair to expect so much from a group that it's still trying to consolidate its position and its power. And again, I think this is something that I think Ijaz alluded to, that, even 20 years of US presence and trillions of dollars of investment, we haven't really seen that on the ground. And I think, therefore, it is unfair to expect that the Taliban need to deliver on certain fronts, and then we will engage, or then we will provide some sort of assistance or support. I think the aim is, again, it shouldn't be based on recognition. It shouldn't revolve around recognition, but engagement. And I think the Taliban is a group that can deliver. I think, the fact that, it's become media savvy, it is depending on the art of diplomacy, and it's reaching out to countries that one wouldn't have expected. I mean, let us not forget, they used Moscow as a platform to not only showcase their policies. If you remember, Abbas Tanakzai made the group's policies very clear, but they also engaged with other political factions. So I think it's important. But again, I think, time needs to be given to the group. I mean, I'm not an advocate for the group, but certainly they've just taken over. And I think the next 6 months will certainly be critical in terms of the group delivering. So, one has to wait and see. But again, I think the major ingredient of this is that you have to continue to engage with the group. And secondly, I just wanted to add to the previous question regarding, the Afghan National Security Forces and the police and whatnot. The group has generally said that there's going to be amnesty. But look, there are deep and divided divisions within Afghanistan. Let us not forget, regional countries can only do so much. At the end of the day, the Afghans have to compromise and accommodate each other. And political and ethnic divisions do exist. So I think one shouldn't expect that the Taliban is going to automatically, have the Afghan National Security Forces, and it's going to be inclusive and whatnot. Let us give the group time to consolidate.
Great.
Just to quickly add to,
Yeah,
just to quickly add to what Amna said, imagine the Taliban in the 90s writing to the UN Credentials Committee an application saying that you have to, recognize us as the legitimate. They did not even know about these things. I mean, they look at the way they operated in terms of economy and the rest of it. These guys have been exposed to the highest echelons of diplomacy in various parts of the world, frankly, and in terms of, diplomats from a number of countries. And so they have become much more savvy. The issue is that they also have, their entire movement is underpinned by a certain ideology. And so you have to look at what kind of marriage there's going to be between ideology and pragmatism. And then you also have the moderates and you have the hardliners. So there is an internal debate and discussion also going on. And I think the reason why Pakistan is saying that you have to sort of, give them time before they can begin to do certain other things, I think that merits, further discussion.
I think excellent. Just Amna, just to push on that, you also said something about legitimacy will come with performance, and you said Afghanistan doesn't have institutions, so how can they show that performance? It will take time. So how to correlate this thing? And also, there you said they're seeking legitimacy, but at the same time they're also signaling, and there are statements by some of the Afghan spokesperson that nobody from outside should tell us what to do or what not to do. Now, there's a dichotomy about this. They are seeking legitimacy, but they're discouraging even, some of them have pointed towards Pakistan also, that don't tell us what to do or not to do. How to reconcile that?
Look, I think one has to look at the group in its totality. The group has shown certain signs of reform. I'm not saying there's a change in the ideology, but I think they've realized that even though Afghanistan has been at war, with itself and the international community for more than 20 years, the group, Afghanistan has evolved. And I think the Taliban realized that. And again, we have seen, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I do realize that. But the fact that, the Taliban have made instrumental changes, let us go back to even the peace process. It was the Taliban that actually wrote letters and reached out to the Americans. Also, the fact that the group is talking about an inclusive constitution, and they do talk about women's rights. These are important factors. And again, I do realize that we will have to see how they implement them. But I think again, coming back, we cannot expect such drastic changes immediately because it's going to affect the group and its morale. Remember, these fighters have grown up in war, and all they've seen is this typical ideology of the group where it said that there has to be an expulsion of foreign forces in Sharia. And if all of a sudden they introduce drastic reforms, it just might have an internal revolt in the group. And I don't think the group is willing to jeopardize 20 years of a struggle for that. So we're going to see changes slowly coming about. And I do recognize when you said that, they said that Pakistan should not be dictating, but at the same time, you've had then again, other members saying that we are open to, a regional approach and consensus where we're willing to work with regional partners. So I think that provides the room that they might be willing to accommodate the demands of regional countries. And one will again have to wait and see. But I think one has to focus on the group and its limitations, particularly the fact that they've just consolidated power. There have been slight internal differences within the group. And therefore, I don't think the group is going to drastically make changes and jeopardize its overall approach. We're going to see changes. When they initially announced the government, there weren't any other representatives. Yes, I know 5 or 6, other factions doesn't really make a difference, but it is a small and incremental change.
Great. Coming back to Elizabeth, there's a question by Ms. Itfa Khurshid. It's a straightforward question. What are the lessons learned by the United States out of Afghanistan? Some just key lessons. Okay, just I'll add to this, given this shift, this emerging focus on Asia Pacific and new alliances being built, do you think there would be any stomach in the United States military or the State Department, or as a whole, United States, would they be still interested in Afghanistan? So just your thought. And Jaz, could you did explain the Iran, and there's a question by one of our students. She has asked, looking at the Iranian interest in Afghanistan, what could be the future of Pakistan-Iran relations, because there could be some conflict over there also. So if you could address this aspect. So first,
yeah, I've actually I've actually responded to her. I sent
Okay.
her a message.
Okay. So it's done.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
On the lessons learned question, again, I think it's still early days, but overall, maybe I can share what I hope will be some of the lessons learned. I can't speak to the extent to which they have actually been learned. My hope is that there will be a continuing conversation to assess what went wrong, and that this will not be swept under the rug as we turn our attention to great power competition with China. I think that is the next focus that is likely to come about, but we owe it to the people of Afghanistan, to the service members and diplomats who have paid the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan, both US and international, to think through what happened here. And both to make an honest accounting of what went wrong, to acknowledge what was able to be accomplished. I think going forward, a few things come to mind. Number one is just being wary of intervention along these lines, to recognize that even if there is a relatively easy way in, an easy path to victory, quote unquote, there is no easy way out. And that fundamentally is how we wound up in the situation. I don't tend to agree with those who argue that this would have resolved differently had the US not taken its attention away and gone into Iraq. I think it's an open question. It's a counterfactual that's interesting to think through, but I think some of just the early signs of challenges ahead or dark clouds on the horizon were already there at that point, and that just the structural factors that we've talked through today might have played out, if not the same way, at least similarly. Another, in terms of how the US approach has changed over the past 20 years, is I think when it comes to terrorism, it's really a problem to be managed rather than a war to be won. You've seen the shift in approach, particularly in the Middle East, particularly in the Sahel and parts of Africa as well, where it is small groups of special forces who are in an advisory role working with and through local partners. That seems to be the approach that has been taken. The challenge there, of course, is you're dependent then on those local partners. And there are political and social consequences of that. And so I think we should be careful of what that means going forward and acknowledge that this is not a perfect recipe for moving forward. But overall, a good bit of humility, I think, is in order at this point before just barreling forward and not taking those lessons learned. And I would actually point to the hearings that have been ongoing in Congress. Some of these questions are already being asked, right? And one of the things that I do appreciate about the discourse so far is whether it is, on one side of the aisle or the other, there's an open conversation going on in op-ed pages, in newspapers, and in television programs on the Hill. And so I think that assessment is happening, but it will just take a little bit longer to see what lessons are ultimately taken from it.
Great. Thank you very much. And with this, I think we will wind up. There are a number of other questions, but it could go on for maybe 1 hour more, but it was a commitment for 2 hours. And we will wind up over here. And I must thank all of you. Ijaz Haider had to leave early. He had some work-related commitment. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Amna, for taking time out and joining us. It was a pleasure having you. And I'm sure my students, they would benefit a lot. And we would continue to have these conversations based on this webinar in our classes also. So thank you for being with us tonight. And for you, Elizabeth Morning, thank you for taking time out. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, all.